Everything that boy has ever done is bring me nothing but embarrassment. My father's voice didn't rise. It never had to. It sliced clean through the firehouse banquet hall like he'd rehearsed the cut 100 times in the mirror. 300 people went still. Every fork stopped halfway to every mouth, and every set of eyes in that room landed on me, armed with the contempt my own father had just handed them, gift-wrapped. He turned to the woman beside him, Master Sergeant Renee Castillo, an Army combat medic with a chest full of ribbons, and put his hand flat on her shoulder like he was presenting a trophy. "This," he announced to the room, "is the kind of soldier I always wanted, a real protector. Not somebody who plays with spreadsheets for a living and calls it serving his country." My uncle laughed into his napkin. My cousin smirked down at her plate. I stood in the middle of that hall in my dress blues, the eagle, globe, and anchor pinned crisp on my collar, and I absorbed it the way I'd absorbed everything from him since I was a kid. But Renee Castillo wasn't laughing. Her eyes had locked onto the small silver device clipped above my left breast pocket, the one civilians never notice and operators never forget. Her face went through something I'd only ever seen on people who'd been shot at. She took a half step back, jaw slack, and asked a question that landed in that hall like a dropped glass. "Wait, you're Tango 9? But before I tell you what happened in the 4 minutes after she said that, and why my father's 40-year story about who I was collapsed right there on the parquet floor, hit that like button and subscribe, because what came next, not one person in that room saw coming. Not even me, if I'm honest. The Ridgefield Volunteer Firefighters Association held its Family of Service dinner every October in the same banquet hall they'd been renting since before I was born, the kind of place with a popcorn ceiling and a portrait of some long-dead fire chief watching over the buffet line. My father, Walter, had been a volunteer firefighter for 31 years before his knees gave out, and every fall he stood at that podium like the dinner belonged to him personally. He introduced Renee Castillo that night, the way you'd introduce a long-lost son, chest puffed, voice warm in a way I hadn't heard directed at me since I was maybe 7 years old. Then he turned to me. His eyes went flat, the particular flat I'd grown up flinching from, and he delivered the line I now understood he'd been workshopping for weeks, because I'd heard versions of it before, at Thanksgiving, at my cousin's wedding, at my grandmother's funeral, where he'd actually used the word freeloader over a casket. This wasn't temper. Temper burns hot and forgets itself. This was a campaign, and my father didn't run spontaneous campaigns. He picked the venue, he picked the date, he picked the audience, 300 people who'd known me since I was in Cub Scouts, who'd be primed and ready to nod along, because that's what you do when Walter Dunmore takes the podium in this town. I stood there in my uniform with my hand sliding into my jacket pocket, thumb finding the record button on my phone, an old habit from years of debriefs where you learn that nobody remembers what actually got said unless somebody wrote it down. I should explain something about where I'd come from, because if you only knew me from that banquet hall, you'd think I grew up with nothing behind me. That's not true. There was exactly one person who saw me clearly, and that was my mother, Diane, who died of ovarian cancer the spring I turned 26. My father remarried 11 months later, a woman named Carol who wore my mother's old garden gloves and rearranged my mother's kitchen within a month of moving in. And somewhere in that transition, the story of who I was got rewritten without my permission. The daughter who used to win the county science fair, who used to fix the lawnmower when nobody else could be bothered, became, in my father's retelling, the disappointment. The girl who joined the Marines to do something with computers instead of something with a rifle, like that made it not count. I remember the year I told him I'd been accepted into a signals intelligence program, a track that meant I'd be working communications and electronic warfare instead of walking a patrol with a weapon slung across my chest. He didn't even look up from the grill. "Figures," he said. "Even in the military you found a way to sit at a desk." I was 20 years old and I drove 4 hours back to base that night without stopping once, because crying in a moving car felt safer than crying anywhere he might hear about it. My mother was the one who'd driven me to my enlistment physical at 5 in the morning, because I didn't want my father to know yet, didn't want him to have the chance to talk me out of it, or worse, talk me into something else. She sat in the parking lot of the processing station with a thermos of coffee and a paperback novel for 6 hours, and when I came out, she didn't ask how it went. She just handed me the thermos and said, "You did the thing you were scared of. That's the whole job today." She died 2 years into my enlistment, while I was stationed overseas, and I made it home for the funeral with 11 hours to spare, in uniform, because there hadn't been time to change. At that funeral, my father stood 2 feet from the casket and let Carol's sister hold his arm the entire service, while I stood off to the side because nobody had thought to save me a seat in the family row. Nobody apologized for it. Nobody seemed to notice it had happened at all, except me, and the version of me that filed it away the way you file away every piece of intel that doesn't fit the official story yet, because someday it might. I want to tell you about the letters, because the comments people leave on stories like this always ask why we keep reaching back toward people who've made it clear they don't want us. So here's my answer. The month I made staff sergeant, I sent my father a photograph of myself getting pinned, along with a short letter. No apology in it, because I didn't have anything to apologize for. Just 2 lines telling him I'd made rank and that I hoped he was doing all right. 3 weeks later, it came back unopened, the seal still flat and sealed, my own handwriting staring back at me from the front of an envelope that had traveled 400 miles and accomplished nothing. I sent another one the year I finished my first overseas rotation, same result. After that I stopped, not because I'd given up exactly, but because in my line of work, when a channel goes consistently dark, you stop transmitting on it and you build a different one. I built a different one, I just never told him what was on it. What was on it was 4 years inside a windowless operations center at a base in the Pacific, monitoring signal traffic that most people will never know existed, let alone understand. What was on it was a green spiral notebook I kept in my desk drawer, where I wrote down the names of every operator whose mission depended on the intercepts I was running. Because there's a tradition in that world, an unofficial one, where before a high-risk op the team leads stop by your station and tap 2 knuckles against the desk, quick, quiet, never quite making eye contact, because making eye contact would mean admitting out loud what the tap actually meant. It meant, if I don't come back, you'll know why, because you're the one who saw it coming or didn't. I never offered comfort when they did that. Comfort gets people killed in my line of work, because it's a lie, and lies make you sloppy. What I offered instead was the truth, plotted on a map, delivered flat and clear. I don't do reassurance. I do probability. Stay off Route 6 after 2200. Your extraction window holds if you're moving by 100. That was the whole conversation every time, and it was the only kind of comfort that ever actually worked. One operator in particular used to come by more than the others, a young petty officer attached to a joint task force, jittery in a way he tried hard to hide, gripping his weapon like it might wander off without him. His name doesn't matter for this story, except that the night before a joint raid on a compound we'd been tracking for 6 weeks, he stopped at my desk and asked me straight out if I saw anything bad happening. Not a tactical question. An emotional one dressed up as a tactical one, which meant he was scared and had come looking for certainty instead of comfort, the only thing I was ever qualified to give. I slid a marked overlay across the desk. I don't do fortune-telling, I told him. I do risks that can be quantified. Stay off the eastern approach. The compound's rear exit isn't covered the way command thinks it is. Follow the contingency route to the letter and you'll be standing here telling me about it tomorrow. That night, exactly the way the analysis said it would, his unit got pinned against the compound's east wall, walking straight into a kill zone command hadn't flagged. The reroute I'd pushed through a backup channel 10 minutes before contact, a channel that existed nowhere in the official op plan because I never trust a plan without a second one hiding behind it, was the only thing standing between his team and a body count. He's still in the service today, still wearing his stripes, still alive to laugh at things that aren't funny, because a woman he'd never met outside a windowless room drew a line on a map at 3 a.m. Not because of Walter Dunmore. Not because of the version of fatherhood he performed for the Volunteer Fire Association every October. That fact sat entirely outside the story my father had ever told about me, because he'd never once asked. The worst night of my career came 18 months later. A convoy callsign Foxtrot 2 was rolling a supply route when the lead vehicle hit a pressure plate. The blast came through the comms channel like something physical, a fist through glass, then half a second of nothing, which is the worst sound in this job, because it means the radio operator just got thrown clear of the truck. Then the screaming started. Foxtrot 2 to Overlord, we are pinned, taking casualties, request immediate support, we are about to lose this position. The operations center went sideways around me, officers shouting over each other, status boards flashing red, a chair going over somewhere behind me. My pulse didn't move, I'd trained it not to. Every quick reaction force in range was at least 35 minutes out by air, and 35 minutes might as well be 3 days when people are dying by the minute. I took the comms handset without asking anyone's permission. Foxtrot 2, this is Overlord. Abort your current position. Hostiles are converging from your northeast. Fall back to the grid I'm sending now. Do not question it, move. No reassurance, because reassurance costs 3 lives in the time it takes to say it. I'd already noticed the primary channel was being jammed, fed garbage for the last 4 minutes, so I cut it and switched to a shadow frequency I'd set up myself before the operation, one that didn't officially exist. 40 seconds later, I'd breached a coordination network I had no clearance to touch in peacetime, the kind of violation that ends careers when nobody's shooting at you, and the only thing standing between 8 men and a flag-draped homecoming when somebody is. 2 aircraft on routine patrol banked hard and came in from the coordinates I'd plotted off thermal imaging in under 2 minutes. The fire stopped. Then his voice came back through the static, shredded but alive. Overlord, we are clear. Confirm 0 additional casualties. The next morning, my commanding officer dropped a folder on my desk with 3 characters written across the corner in red ink by hand. Tango 9. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. In the world I worked in, that designation became shorthand fast. The operator who reroutes the war from inside a dark room before anyone topside even knows there was a different war to fight. He looked at me for a long moment and said one sentence I've kept since. Whatever the men in your life told you about where women belong in this, Sergeant Dunmore, you just rewrote it. I thought about the green notebook in my drawer, the names in it, the families who'd never get the phone call I'd rehearsed in my head so many times I could deliver it in my sleep. I didn't need my father to understand any of that. The silence in that notebook was the only medal I ever needed. Back at the banquet hall, none of that had happened yet as far as anyone in the room knew. Renee Castillo's question was still hanging in the air, "You're Tango 9, and my father's face had gone through that half-second freeze you only get from someone who suddenly realizes the script in their hand doesn't match the room anymore. He recovered fast, the way he always did, waving a hand like he was swatting a fly. "Tango whatever," he said, "some kind of paperwork callsign. Don't let her fool you, Renee. This one's been hiding behind a computer since she was 12 years old." Nobody laughed this time. The silence in that hall had changed texture, gone dense in a way Walter Dunmore had clearly never encountered from this particular audience before. Because for the first time in his life, the room wasn't following his lead. Renee straightened her shoulders. The polite guest smile she'd been wearing all night burned off her face like it had never been there. She dropped her chin the way you do for a superior officer, and her voice carried wall to wall. "With respect, sir, Sergeant Dunmore doesn't hide behind anything. She's the reason 8 of my brothers walked off a compound that should have buried them. She found the trap nobody else saw, broke the jamming in real time, and pulled air support out of thin air to get them home. She doesn't carry a rifle into the fight. She makes sure the rest of us come back from it." My uncle's beer glass stopped halfway to his mouth. My cousin's phone, which had been filming for the toast, lowered slowly into her lap. Carol's sister, who'd held my father's arm at my mother's funeral, looked down at the tablecloth like it had suddenly become very interesting. And my father, who had built 30 years of a story on the idea that I was the disappointment in this family, the one who sat at a desk while real men did real things, stood at that podium with his mouth slightly open and nothing coming out of it, because for the first time in his life, somebody he'd handpicked to humiliate me had turned around and testified against him instead. An old man near the front, 91 years old by the look of him, a cane worn smooth from decades of use, pushed himself slowly to standing. Then the man beside him. Then a woman in the 3rd row, whose son I later learned had served 2 tours. Then it moved through the hall the way grief moves through a room after bad news, silent and total, every veteran in that banquet hall rising out of their folding chairs. No applause, no sound at all except chair legs scraping against linoleum. That was the most expensive silence I'd ever stood inside, more expensive than any medal in any case on any wall, because it couldn't be bought, couldn't be staged, and couldn't be taken back. It said, "We see what this cost her, and nobody at this podium has the authority to erase it." I stood up from my table. My shoes hit that linoleum floor with a sound that cracked through the quiet like something breaking, and every step toward my father felt like the only honest thing I'd done in that building all night. I stopped 2 feet from him, close enough to see Carol's hand tighten on his sleeve, and I looked at the same eyes that used to watch me get screamed at for a B+ and say nothing in my defense. "Respect isn't something you get to assign from a podium," I told him, loud enough to reach the back wall. "It's something you earn doing work nobody in this room, including you, ever bothered to ask me about. Don't you ever use my uniform as a punchline again?" I held his gaze 3 seconds longer than was comfortable for either of us. Then I turned and walked back to my seat, and nobody sat down next to him for the rest of that dinner. I drove to the house that night, the one I grew up in, not for him, but for the last box of things that still belonged to my mother, sitting untouched in the attic because Carol had never gotten around to clearing it. He was in the kitchen when I came through the back door, standing at the sink, with his hands braced on the rim, like he needed it to hold him up, not waiting for me. Just nowhere left to go. I pulled out a chair at the table my mother used to make me do homework at and set my cover down on the wood, and I said nothing. Because in my line of work, there's a technique called pressure through silence, and it works better than any direct question. Because it forces the other person to fill the gap with whatever they've been carrying. He broke first. His voice came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. I always thought I'd have a son who'd carry the family name into something I could brag about at the fire hall. What I did tonight was stupid. That wasn't an apology. People like my father don't apologize, they downgrade. Stupid makes 30 years of deliberate cruelty sound like a math error instead of what it actually was. I let the words sit there a moment before I answered him. I didn't need to be your son to defend this family's name, I said. I built my own, with my own hands, in places you'll never get clearance to know about. You didn't break me, and you're never getting another shot at trying. He sank into the chair across from me, and whatever was left of the man who'd run that banquet hall like a campaign manager folded down into something much smaller, an old man in a flannel shirt sitting in a kitchen he no longer fully recognized. One word came out of him, dry and strange in his mouth, like a language he'd memorized but never actually used. Proud, he said. Careful with it, the way you'd handle a piece of glass you just found on the floor. It landed on the table between us and didn't weigh anything at all, because some words show up 20 years too late to fill the space they were supposed to fill. They just confirmed the space was always there. I stood up, picked up my cover from the table, and walked out through the same door I'd come in. I didn't slam it, didn't say anything else. Just let it close soft behind me, the way you leave a room once there's genuinely nothing left on the agenda. The next morning, before my flight back out, I drove to the cemetery on the edge of town, not out of obligation, but because there was exactly one person who'd earned the right to hear how the night had gone. I found my mother's marker under the big maple she used to talk about wanting to be buried near, and I crouched down and put my bare hand flat against the cold stone. I made it, I told her, just like you said in that parking lot. I did the thing I was scared of, and I kept doing it, and last night the people who matter finally saw it too. I reached into my jacket and took out the thermos cap she used to keep on her keychain, the one I'd carried in some version of my gear for almost a decade, through 3 duty stations and more nights than I can count, and I set it on the ledge of her headstone, facing up, the way she used to leave it on the kitchen counter every morning before work. I don't need to carry this anymore, I told her. I've got my own name now, and it's enough. I stood, straightened my jacket, and held a salute for 5 full seconds, not because regulation required it, and not because anyone was watching, but because it was the only gesture I had left that could carry what I was feeling without it spilling over. Then I turned and walked back to the car without looking back, the cemetery behind me, the flight ahead of me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence in my chest didn't feel like something missing. It felt like something finished. Sometimes peace doesn't come wrapped in someone else's apology. Sometimes it just arrives the day you finally stop waiting for one.